England's villages. Pretty cottages with wonky windows, roses and hollyhocks in neatly tended gardens. It's a cosy chocolate box image that's recognised across the globe. I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist, I'm fascinated by the places where we live and how they've evolved throughout history. For me, the story of our villages from the Normans to the present day is not one of sleepy rural idylls. It's a story of purpose and power. Lavenham in Suffolk is known as the best preserved medieval village in the country. The power here came from making woolen cloth that was sold across England and Europe. It became one of the wealthiest places in England, and it's where some of the country's first entrepreneurs flourished. But their businesses unravelled. Lavenham is a story of medieval boom and bust. The first thing you notice about Lavenham is the number of beautiful buildings. You won't find its match anywhere in the country. This is an incredible survival, a late medieval shopfront, and the idea is the shutter goes up there, down there, but you can prop this one up to create a stall right on the marketplace. Lavenham is so different from earlier villages. When the Normans conquered England in the 11th century, villages were ruled fiercely by barons. They often built castles to defend their new realm. 300 years later, Lavenham was built without defences or signs of feudal structure. Its foundations were manufacturing, money and trade. There are scores of medieval timber-framed houses. Many of them are ostentatious with elaborate details. Other features are purely practical. Because Lavenham was at the centre of the medieval woolen cloth industry. And it's littered with echoes of its success, if you know where to look. Now this is intriguing. Just a few small holes with the remains of pegs in them, but imagine pegs coming out of here. Then imagine yarn being strung out backwards and forwards to create a warp for the loom. Traces of the machinery of wool production and yarn and cloth production are really hard to come by, but here, these few small holes just could be an indication of that process. I didn't expect to see anything like this at all. This is a tiny door in a much, much bigger door. And this massive door isn't for some portly owner. It's so you can get goods into the house, maybe bales of cloth. You could even get a small pack horse if you needed to. This is a curious feature, a door on the first floor. This is so they could get wool upstairs easily without having to go up narrow, winding stairs. Clearly it was a wealthy place, but why here? Why in the middle of remote rural Suffolk? There's nothing obvious to explain it. It's not a river port, there's no grand abbey. The answer is partly to do with the De Vere family, the Earls of Oxford, whose tombs lie in a chapel in the nearby village of Bewers. Lavenham was part of a manor granted to them by William the Conqueror. Alberic de Vere was one of William's barons, and his descendants were instrumental in the growth of Lavenham.
The shepherd, a very important...
Dr. Nicholas Amor has written books about the medieval wool industry in Suffolk.
The lords of the manor in Lavenham were the De Veres, a very important family, and they appreciated the benefits that they could accrue from having a flourishing cloth industry in Lavenham. There's a remarkably high percentage of ordinary peasants in Suffolk who enjoyed personal freedom, much higher percentage than in many counties, for instance, in the West Midlands. So they started off at a bit of an advantage in that respect, and with that freedom they were not tied by heavy labour services. They could begin to spend time making cloth.
Then in 1348, the Black Death struck England. Up to half the population died. With less labour available, landowners had to turn from arable farming to sheep farming. In the Middle Ages, wool represented half of England's wealth. Almost everyone wore woolen clothes, so cloth was made in huge quantities and even exported to the continent. Though it wasn't farming sheep that made Lavenham rich. Villagers brought in fleeces from as far away as the Welsh borders, then built their success by turning those fleeces into cloth.
The textile industry in the late Middle Ages is probably the first example of big business, big industry in this country. And the heartland is here in Suffolk, and at the very centre of that heartland is Lavenham. It has such an enormously important place in the economic development of this country for that very reason.
And this is what it was all about, Lavenham blue cloth. This was famous throughout England, famous throughout Europe. None of the original fabric 500 years old survives, and this is as close as we can come to what the medieval shopper wanted, a sort of denim of its day. Marion Knights is a member of the Lavenham Guild of Weavers, Spinners and Dyers, who've revived the traditional methods to make Lavenham blue cloth again.
The whole population of Lavenham, really, right the way through to the end product, they were all specialists in their own field. Everybody had come there, everybody that was necessary, everyone had their own little bit to do, a bit like an ant's nest. Everyone was wheedling away, specialising in their particular thing, and they were very, very good at it, very good at it. And that's what Lavenham's wealth was built on that specialism.
Leaves from woad plants were used to dye the wool. It's a complex chemical process, and the best method was to dye the fleece before it was spun into yarn, which is where we get the expression dyed in the wool.
You just can't guarantee ever to match a colour, which is why I think in the olden days they dyed in the wool, they dyed the fleece, because then each subsequent dip in the dye bath that would have come out a paler shade, once all that fleece was all mixed together and carded together, you would have had a more uniform shade.
Spinning was carried out by women using a drop spindle until spinning wheels were introduced later in the Middle Ages to improve efficiency.
With a drop spindle, you could just carry the spindle and a pocket full of fleece. Anywhere you went, you could spin walking along. It really didn't matter where you were, and it would just go back in your pinny pocket. But spinning with a spinning wheel, although it's faster, it did mean then it was a sedentary thing. You had to sit there and spin. You couldn't just pick up your spinning wheel. The young women of the household, before they got old enough to actually get married and have a household of their own to run, they would be the spinsters, which is where the word comes from, because they had the time to sit in the corner and spin.
The spinners and weavers made the famous cloth. They were outworkers. There were scores of them working in the cottages in and around Lavenham. It was piecework, rather like the gig economy today. And they weren't the people getting rich. This is the crucial element in the Lavenham story. A new class of person emerges, a merchant class called the clothiers, and they could afford to build places like this. The clothiers bought the raw wool and paid the outworkers to turn it into cloth. Clothiers had the power. They made the deals and the money. Little Hall was first built in the 14th century, probably for a clothier named William Corston. Dinah James is a local historian and guide at Little Hall.
The merchants were able to work at getting a good reputation. They were able to work at being trusted, because a lot of the industry that we're talking about was all done on credit. People owed money up the chain. And at the very bottom of the chain, of course, was the poor worker, the spinner and the dyer and the weaver. But as the cloth was produced and then it was sold, then the money would come in.
So it's important for the clothier to project this sense of longevity, status, we're here to stay, you can trust us, and that's reflected in the buildings.
Absolutely. I mean, they weren't wealthy when they came. It was the wealth that they generated once they had developed their business. And at the height of Lavenham's wealth, there probably were about 30 clothiers who had set up here.
So these are businessmen, they're becoming successful, what we might call entrepreneurs in the modern era.
Definitely.
Lavenham is embedded in the countryside, but it feels curiously urban in character with these tightly knit rows of houses. Business was booming, more trade, more workers, and they all wanted to be here on this small hill. Spinners and weavers couldn't afford big houses. Some would have had their own cottages, others would live in tenements which were owned by the clothiers. The sheer number of clothiers' houses shows just how successful Lavenham was. By the 1520s, it had become the 14th wealthiest place in England, exceeding even Lincoln and York. By now, it was not known as a village, but it was famous as a wool town. The medieval clothiers were an ingenious lot. Hidden in a house in Water Street is evidence of their investment in the infrastructure. It's a real medieval rarity.
It's just through here.
An underground passage runs the length of the street, and I've been given access to a private entrance, concealed under a rug in the living room. Oh my goodness me. This is a bit of a tight squeeze. Oh. This is absolutely incredible. Wow, there's a bend in it, and you can clearly see it's going down slope. Well, it's a brick culvert. It's old brick as well. I mean, this is about the right period. It's 15th, 16th century, and it's actually quite a huge structure. This is a major bit of engineering. We know it's fed from a spring and empties into a river almost half a mile down the street. But we can't be certain why they built it. It might have been for the wool processing, either for a fresh water supply to wash and dye the wool, or to flush away the smelly waste. This is the point that I'm going to emerge into the daylight. That's astounding. You usually only find this kind of thing in the big monasteries. To find it here in Lavenham shows the power of the cloth industry. Oh. By the early 1500s, Lavenham was at its peak in terms of economic prosperity. The industry profited from the clothiers cooperating, and together they created the grandest timber buildings in Lavenham, the Guildhalls. Many parishes had only one Guildhall, and the various guilds would share it, or even meet in a private house. But such was the wealth in Lavenham that the clothiers could afford to display their power and social standing by building several extravagant halls. This was the grandest of them all, known as the Guild of Corpus Christi and reserved for the elite of the village. Jane Gosling is a local historian and used to manage the Guildhall.
This is bling, this is Tudor bling.
Everything's over-engineered, everything's overblown, it's making a real statement.
Absolutely, you don't need half of this timber. It's a way of them showing off. You know, they didn't have indoor swimming pools and fancy cars, so they showed off their wealth through their buildings. It would have been a very, very expensive building to put up, but they didn't care about that. They had the money. They were these wealthy merchants.
In the Middle Ages, this was cutting-edge timber technology. It was built to impress. As well as making a statement of wealth, there were practical uses for the building. It was used for meetings for the members of the guild, the clothiers.
For a meeting room, it's actually relatively small. Some of the walls have been taken out, so if you look over here, you can see the notches, which indicate where the cross passage was, the screens passage.
So a wall here.
Yeah, but as well as that, this side, you can see here we've got notches for a wall that was in this position here.
OK, so again, another wall or a screen here. So it's pretty compact, but it's making a big statement.
Yes.
That suggests that it is few people meeting here. This is not hundreds of the villagers coming in.
We like to think it's the creme de la creme of the Lavenham cloth merchants.
The prime purpose of these guild halls was religious. In medieval times, before the Reformation, religion, wealth and well-being were inseparable. The gathering of wealth was to guarantee a place in heaven.
We know of 500 in Suffolk alone, thousands throughout the country, and their prime function in a Catholic world was to build up a fund of money to pay priests to sing masses for the souls of departed brethren. The Catholic faith, of course, believing that you had to suffer hideous torment in purgatory to atone for your sins before you could get into heaven.
So it's a sort of spiritual insurance, mutual society,
Absolutely.
Something like that.
Yes, yeah.
Anyone entering the marketplace would be left in no doubt that the members of the Guild of Corpus Christi were rich and powerful. The most successful of all their members was the clothier Thomas Spring. His family are also responsible for the scale of Lavenham Church. East Anglia has scores of large wall churches, but this is more like a cathedral. The reason for its grandeur is emblazoned all over the church walls. The Church of St. Peter and St. Paul is peppered with decorations to honour its saints, stars representing the De Veres, the Earls of Oxford, and other marks for the most influential men of Lavenham. Graham Patrick is a churchwarden.
So here we have the Tudor Rose. Alongside we have the crossed keys of St. Peter. And, of course, the five-pointed star of the Earls of Oxford. And over here we have something of great interest, which is the merchant mark of the Spring family. We've got the T for Thomas, not a G as it might appear, and S for Spring.
And you said merchant mark, it's not a coat of arms?
No, it's not a coat of arms. It's the symbol which would have appeared on the cloth that he produced as an indication of quality, which would have been used as tags on their cloth. It's a forerunner, really, of the trademarks that we have today.
Well, this is like having branding on the church, and he's here right alongside De Vere, right alongside St. Peter, St. Paul.
Thomas Spring II was an immensely wealthy clothier. He left a great deal of money towards the rebuilding of the tower here. And I guess he just wanted it to be known that he was partly responsible for this wonderful building.
The sponsor has to have his logo on the product, doesn't he?
That's an interesting way of looking at it, yes.
It took 40 years to complete the tower, and right here at the top is the coat of arms of Thomas Spring III, the son of Thomas Spring II, whose emblem we saw down at the base of the tower. And it was he who gave money to have this tower completed, and it's him who has his emblem up here, not just once, but 32 times. No one else is represented up here. No one else is closer to God in Lavenham than Thomas Spring. It's clear that the Spring family gave huge amounts of money to Lavenham Church, but that would be wasted if nobody prayed for their souls. So Thomas Spring III also paid for a chapel, a parclose screen around his tomb, and for 1,000 masses to be said immediately after his death.
He made an awful lot of money in Lavenham, but for him, the most important thing was the hereafter. He wanted to go to heaven. As we know only too well, booms in the economy are often followed by bust. That was certainly the case in Lavenham in the mid-1500s. A change in fashion was part of the reason. The Lavenham blue cloth fell from favour, and the clothiers failed to adapt to new techniques and designs. These pattern books from the 18th century are some of the earliest surviving examples of the new draperies, similar to those that became fashionable in the 16th century. People wanted fine, patterned cloth, and the contrast with the plain Lavenham cloth is striking. Cathy Terry is a senior curator with Norfolk Museums.
People were hoping for variety and something new, I think, as in the case with fashion today. In the medieval and Tudor period, most people were wearing plain broadcloths and linens of various quality. But as time moved on and as the country's wealth increased and as then more opportunities for different influences came along, so the idea of patterned cloth began to develop. From Tudor times onwards, the preference began to be for a wider range of cloth types, both in furnishing and in costume, and they could range from sumptuous plain silks through to stripy patterned worsteds, and there was so many different types. The world was your oyster, really.
The flourishing city of Norwich, about 50 miles to the north, was becoming the new centre for cloth production. Skilled weavers from Flanders were made welcome in the city, and they brought with them their technical expertise to make the patterned textiles.
Just as Lavenham is beginning to decline, so Norwich is really beginning to take off, and that's where having a much bigger population and more resources are going to just carry it forward in a way that was not possible for Suffolk.
Lavenham had the trappings of an early industrial revolution, with wealthy merchants expanding their businesses. But their inability to keep up with fashion stopped the revolution in its tracks. Lavenham slid into decline and became known once more as a village. So this perfect-looking village, which today we regard as a thing of beauty, actually, in one sense, screams failure. Everywhere I look, I can see evidence of stagnation, arrested development. Successful towns adapt, grow, and are periodically rebuilt or modernised. In Lavenham, only a tiny proportion of the houses look different or post-medieval, because once the boom years were over, very few owners had the money to change and modernise them. The old houses survive not out of some medieval conservation movement, but because people simply didn't have the cash to rebuild them. If we move forward 200 years, we see a few exceptions. This is one of just a handful of examples. If Lavenham had continued to prosper, it would have dozens of similar Georgian-looking buildings. But even these new facades were merely cladding, built in front of the old medieval timber frame. These timbers give a clue to the origins of this building, but here's the crucial one. This post is on the line of the original front wall. It carried a jetty, an overhang on the first floor. This wall was added later. Many buildings in Lavenham simply fell into ruin. Most have now been repaired and restored. This one was done in the 1920s. Now Lavenham looks fabulous, and it rightly has the title of the best preserved medieval village in England. Today, Lavenham is enjoying good times again. Its chocolate box appearance makes it a honeypot for visitors from around the world. Now, locals have found new ways of bringing in money and trade.
So this is our chicken in the hoisin sauce.
Once a month, Justine Paul puts on a farmer's market at Lavenham Village Hall. I heard someone walking round asking, are all these houses open to the public, like it was a theme park?
Yeah.
It's not a theme park. It's never been a theme park. And to continue to succeed, a village has to have a USP, a reason for being in today's world, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's hilarious, but I've seen people peering into people's front windows and jumping out of their skin when someone moves inside, because I think a lot of people are shocked that there are people living in some of the really old houses in the village. But it's a busy, thriving village with a lot of young people, and you do have to keep diversifying to bring other people in, to bring new visitors into the village, definitely.
So this is not Lavenham being fossilised, this is not Lavenham declining, it's Lavenham thriving into the 21st century and beyond.
I think it really is. I wouldn't say it's fossilising at all. I think this place is thriving. I think it's flourishing. It's doing really well.
Lavenham offers us a window into a lost world of early industry, the power of the merchant clothiers and the importance of the church. The village was a place of innovation where money and power were driving change. And it's a reminder that progress can have its setbacks. And what we consider to be one of our best preserved English villages is actually a product of historic failure. There's a real danger in over-romanticising the history of Lavenham, but paradoxically, it's that failure that's handed us the place we cherish today.